Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Shyam Sankar. Shyam, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm a longtime reader of your work, and I said, hey, what the hell? I'm going to reach out to him and see if he'll be willing to come chat. And here we are. So, for folks that don't know you, don't follow some of your publications or even some of your recent testimonies, which are pretty spicy. Tell me a bit about your background and Palantir as well.
Yeah, so I've been at Palantir 19 years. I joined as the 13th employee. I was the first forward deployed engineer, and now I'm Palantir's chief technology officer. So I oversee the roadmaps on both the government and the commercial side, and the delivery and value creation in the field with our customers. And I've been writing more recently, kind of building on these 20 years of experience of trying to bring new innovation to defense and intelligence on what I call the first breakfast. I really think so much of what has challenged innovation in defense is a consequence of the Last Supper. And the Last Supper was this dinner in the Pentagon in 1993. We wanted a peace dividend. We had won the Cold War, or maybe more accurately, the Soviets had lost it. And we slashed spending 67%. And we told all of our defense industrial base, hey, you're not all going to survive. You have permission to consolidate. The popular narrative is that consolidation led to a lack of competition. I don't think that was actually the root cause of our challenges. The root cause is that consolidation led to conformity. It drove away the innovative founders, the crazy engineers. It led us towards a more kind of, paradoxically, a more kind of communist system of unitary efforts. When we were building the submarine-launched ballistic missile, Admiral Rayborn had 4 competing programs, right? Like today, we would view that as wasteful. We have one joint program office for the F-35, and we see how that's going. Maybe we should have had an F-35, F-36, F-37 competing it out. And that sort of aesthetic is what won World War II, what won the Cold War. But as a consequence of the peace dividend, we kind of lost it. And I'm trying to advocate for this sort of commercial innovation that lets us bring that back. I think the other related phenomenon that's super important is that when the Berlin Wall fell, only 6% of major weapon system spending went to defense specialists. The rest went to companies that had both commercial and defense businesses. Chrysler, yes, they built cars, but they also built missiles. Ford built satellites until 1990. General Mills, the cereal company, built artillery. The whole structure of our economy was that we had companies that were invested in both prosperity and freedom. And that's what we really lost at the end of the Cold War. And I think that's important because of how, the nature of innovation. Innovation is a consequence of productivity. When Pontiac started building the Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun in World War II, the organic industrial base used to produce, the unit time was 3.5 hours. Pontiac, able to leverage their know-how of how to build cars, got that down to 15 minutes. And unfortunately, so that's the industrial base. I call it the American industrial base, not the defense industrial base, that won World War II and the Cold War. And unfortunately, that's what China's doing today. Only 27%, I think, of Chinese prime revenue comes from the PLA. The rest is commercial. So all that cheap crap we're buying on Amazon or your neighbor's buying, whatever, it's subsidizing lethality against U.S. service members.
All right. Well, now you open up a few additional questions I hadn't even planned to ask you, but I'm going to ask them anyway. You talked about the tie between, first off, I like the dubbing of, rather than the defense industrial base, the American industrial base. And you're leaning into the fact that there should be one, kind of ecosystem, not this bifurcated system where we have like the defense industrial base that doesn't do any commercial work largely. And then, the broader economy. And we've seen some companies. So I'm curious your perspective on this. Like, obviously, this is not the stance of Palantir, but some companies who don't seem to draw the connection between, economic prosperity and national security, which is something you touched on there, which I'm assuming you guys have, put a bit of a different perspective on. But, what are your thoughts there? Like, in my opinion, like, to have economic prosperity, we must have national security, right? And vice versa. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, national security is not an end unto itself, right? It exists to underwrite our economic prosperity, our individual liberties, the ability for all of us to go out there and do these things. And I think we've kind of lost the plot in a world post-Cold War where we didn't realize, you don't feel viscerally that you have to wake up every day and fight for it. And so it's very easy to lose that plot. I think that led to industrial policies in the 90s and the early aughts where we just outsourced a lot of our production. We really did implicitly buy into the end of history, which is clearly not true. We find ourselves now in an undeclared state of emergency. 300 attacks on U.S. bases by Iran, a pogrom in Israel a year ago. We think now roughly 1 million casualties on the front in Ukraine. we are living in a very dangerous period of time, and we can see how simply the Houthis can hold 15% of global trade hostage with CISOs, right? So we feel now how important national security is to economic prosperity.
Yeah, so I know, me and you talked a little bit off air, and like I know you have a very strong stance when it comes to like the role that software plays now, and will play in the future of the fifth domain of warfare. Cyber warfare, for example. Increasingly, like we're seeing more and more non-kinetic warfare. You could argue we're at war right now with some nations based on in the cyber domain. Some of the activities that are going on and things around our critical infrastructure and things like that. You've also voiced some strong roles on like the state of cyber insurance and like compliance. And how it kind of operates in a static, capacity versus the dynamic, ephemeral nature of workloads and technology. Like, what are your thoughts around, the disjoint there?
Yeah, well, one, I think as a nation, America is so good at software that we kind of underestimate how good we are at it. And the part that I like to highlight for people is, like, why is that the case? Because, there are smart people everywhere. If software was just about IQ, I'm not sure we would be the leading nation alone. Think about the fact that there are 0 Chinese or Indian enterprise software companies that are competitive on the world stage. So my claim to you, we look at Silicon Valley and sometimes people think maybe we imported, all these immigrants or something. We imported software to America. Actually, we did import it to Silicon Valley, but not from India or Israel. We imported it from Iowa. It came from Bob Noyce, the co-founder of Intel, the co-inventor of the transistor. And, software is about culture because it's so structurally chaotic. The question is, how can you get a large group of people to engage in positive sum games in a high trust environment that's fundamentally collaborative? And you can see through that lens why other cultures might struggle with that. And that is the definition of the American Midwestern culture that Bob Noyce brought from Iowa to Silicon Valley. The word open door policy is a Noyceism. He coined that term, right? So in so many ways, we don't understand how our tech culture in America is actually, we are all the progeny of Bob Noyce. Now, so that's the part on software and why I think we need to invest in it very significantly in the present moment, even though we are the best at it, is unlike, at the dawn of World War II, we were the best at mass production. We had figured out mass production, and we put the guy who basically figured out, Bill Knudsen, he was the former number 2 at Ford and number 2 at GM. We put him in charge of mobilizing America for war, to build the arsenal of democracy. Unfortunately, today, our adversary is the best at mass production. So for us to compete, we have to compete asymmetrically. And our unique strength here is around software. And I think we're gonna find ourselves having software-defined production that defines how we get back to being the best at it yet again. Now, more narrowly to cyber, to your point on cyber insurance, I think we sometimes view insurance as this kind of like anodyne, weird area. But we forget that most improvements in automobile safety were a consequence of the insurance industry trying to minimize their payouts. Right? That's good. Seat belts, the regulation of seat belts, crash test safety ratings, the kind of create an entire incentive for the industry to make these things safer and safer and safer was the macro role that insurance played in managing and reducing the aggregate risk. We're not seeing this with cyber insurance. And I think that's largely because we probably have the wrong approach. I think some of this is structural. The last major category of insurance was directors and officers insurance in the 80s. And the historical categories of insurance could be well priced based on historicals. Like, what was my loss rate in the past? With cyber, it's a little too much power law, right? Like it moves very fast. It's very hard to predict what value's at risk. And we've taken a very static approach of, hey, fill out this piece of paperwork, tell me what your practices are. That tells you nothing. And of course, with cyber, all this stuff is empirically measurable, right? You really need to be, as an insurance company, willing to deploy sensors on your customer's network to understand what's going on. It's really about measuring compliance with SLAs. It gets closer to how Tesla does insurance by looking at how you're empirically driving your car and repricing it every month, trying to create that incentive for you to be a better and better driver. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to use insurance, to use things like CISO has been talking about with software liability, to actually put the pebble in the right shoe, which is absolutely the person who produces the software, to drive down risk, to drive up hygiene and compliance, to make this stuff safer.
Yeah, I think you kind of open a door for another topic I'll dive into is like, you talked about the software developer, right? The manufacturer, supplier, whatever phrase we want to rally around. They are in the best position to fix the issue, before it gets externalize the risk onto consumers, customers, and broader society, right? And there's an interesting conversation, like you said, around software liability and then conversely safe harbor. But many, I think, are afraid that what will this do to innovation, right? And you talked about some of the international implications, like, for example, I saw the French president, I believe it was, saying the EU is on the brink of a collapse. And like you talked about the software exceptionalism of the United States and companies here. And if you look at like the outsized presence around, U.S. leadership around software companies, large global, success examples, it is unique in that regard. Like, how do we juggle the, that dichotomy of, software liability and having some, kind of enforcement, but also not stifling innovation and the unique, exceptionalism we see now among U.S. companies, for example?
I mean, that's exactly the right question. I think it can be solved. So a bad version of this is about compliance and essentially a legal exercise. There's obviously a part of that that's there, but really this has to be about technology and about getting the tool chain right. So when you're a new company, you're getting started, what tool chain are you inheriting? And with no intended disrespect, I think the hyperscalers are providing what people are asking for today, but essentially the burden is on you as a developer to fully secure it. The opinion on how to do this correctly in a secure way would be unwelcome because it'd be viewed as a tax on the developer and it'd put you at a competitive disadvantage. If we reshape the market so that security is an expectation, every one of these companies is going to have an interest in working with the hyperscaler that has the most opinionation on security, that's willing to take on more of that burden. And our fundamental philosophy, I think, as a consequence of our pathing at Palantir, having started with government, is that it's never the customer's fault if breach happens. In the commercial world, that's the default. Well, you misconfigured it. This is your fault. You look at Snowflake and AT&T, right? But in the government world, the vendors think about it as no, it's always my fault. The bar is very high. My entire business rests on my reputation here, and I'm going to ensure my customers have no foot guns, even if that means they complain, even if it means it's harder. Like, I have to internalize security on their behalf. And if every person in the value chain does that, you have this sense of extreme ownership where you're gonna drive towards the right outcomes. And there is a tax. I was talking to an engineer. He's like, some of the things we do, it's a tax, but it's a tax that funds the interstate highway system. It's a tax that's worth paying.
Yeah, I think you talked about, the unique role of Palantir, and you and I have talked about, like, you're passionate about maybe externalizing some of the things you guys have built, platforms and safeguards and guardrails in the context of the infrastructure, software infrastructure, things like that. What I think that can play a role of, a lot of the defense industrial base, or should I say American industrial base, their core competency isn't building, software defined platforms and cybersecurity and safeguards like that. They may have a unique business. They just want to do business, right, with what their core competency is to the DoD, for example, but they have to meet all these requirements, right, to do so. I mean, what are your thoughts around how platforms and externalizing those capabilities can benefit companies like that?
Yeah, I see a huge opportunity to do that. So, I think if you think about Palantir, maybe from the outside, it can kind of seem like a monolith, but my lived reality as CTO is I have more than 200 independent dev teams shipping 5,000 microservices to 1,000 production environments. You can't do that with classic DevOps or SREs, right? To operate at that scale, you have 1,000 highly heterogeneous environments. You have a huge number of products that are being independently. We do 90,000 upgrades a week. You have to build robots to do all of that for you. And through, humans don't deploy software at Palantir, robots do. And that gives you the opportunity to build a huge amount of software infrastructure. Forget about the software, but the software infrastructure to manage this. So everything from in toto verification on code commit. So I know who's actually committing the code. I have custody of all of the artifacts along the way. My robots won't put things in production that don't check out, all the way to the Kubernetes substrate itself and how I manage that. I treat container images as immutable. I don't patch the images. I kill them randomly every 40 to 72 hours. That also forces good hygiene. Engineers have to build HA software. It's impossible. Your thing is going to be destroyed out from underneath you. So how are you designing for cattle, not pets, and every piece of software that you're writing? But by doing that and treating these images as immutable and rehydrating from trusted images where I'm pulling fully patched OSs, you get so much security advantage. You're making it so hard. And I'm centralizing the opinionation on that in a way that every one of those 200 dev teams, basically, they don't have foot guns. They don't have to think about these things. I'm making the happy path, the secure path. And people call this secure by default and secure by design. But so we had to do that, I think, given the unique nature of our own customer footprint. In the same way that I think Amazon had to build a ton of infrastructure to sell you books, and AWS ended up being the much bigger business. I see an opportunity to say, look, we built this for ourselves, but I can give everyone a running head start here, from the smallest 2-person Y Combinator startup to huge Fortune 500 companies so that they can just wipe away a huge amount of this cost and ride the rails of this automation.
Yeah, I'm personally a big fan of that approach. Palantir and others are, looking to follow a similar path. Is we realize that most companies aren't building, software-defined infrastructure at this scale, the safeguards. You talked about ephemeral workloads. All in toto, like most companies, like, hey, I just have this thing that I want to do for the DoD, and I need to meet these requirements. Like, how can this platform help me do that? So I think that that's a great direction we need to go into, is let people do what they do best, and outsource some of the other things to platform providers, technology providers, et cetera. You did mention something that you talked about, robots deploying software, and there's not a human in the loop. But given you've been around DoD for a long time now, you're likely familiar with like our ATO processes, risk management framework, the way that DoD does compliance, and it's much different than that. So in your experience, like what are some ways you've run into some of that friction, and like what are some ways you think it needs to change so that we can get to that iterative software, agile software development, deployment methodology versus like stack time-based assessments and manual activities and paper-based documentation and all the things we love and know so well when we think about compliance in the DoD sometimes.
Well, really, the way I think about it is, okay, of the controls that you need in RMF or any of these processes, how many of them can I bake into this software, and how many of them do humans have to do? So we were going through this exercise with Brian Kroger at Rise 8, and he's like, okay, you've kind of basically taken 90% of the controls and turned them into software-based controls. So yes, in this environment, you got to handle 10%. As humans, but it gives you so much leverage in being able to do that. And really, I think we had to do that. If you thought about, our environment, again, going back to 5,000 microservices, we didn't start there. We started with some number. It changes all the time. They grow. I can't be going through a process where I need to recertify or put in a change request for every single one of these. I need to certify the boundary that is managed by my software infrastructure, what we call Apollo and Rubix, and things that are deployed into that environment then inherit those controls. And that has given us a huge amount of leverage. And I think that's where we need to go. I think one of the paradoxes of government versus the commercial world, in the commercial world, people are viewed as very expensive and technology is cheap. In government, people are viewed as abundant and technology is somehow viewed as unaffordable. And this is, I think, one of the challenges of having, since the Cold War, putting our defense industrial base essentially on these Galapagos Islands. It's a very labor-based model. And in the labor-based model, you're never going to get the leverage you need to invest in automation and software. You're always going to be lagging there. And this has been true for all time. When Bob Noyce, in the late 60s, I think 96% of integrated circuit sales were to Apollo and the DoD, so the Apollo program and the DoD. But he never let more than 4% of his R&D budget come from the DoD because he didn't want the DoD program managers having control over what he was investing in. He invented the transistor. Who better to know where it's going to go? He always was playing for the bigger future market. And that's valuable for DoD to the point of national security and economic prosperity being linked. Think about the untold prosperity that has been created for the US and for the world because of the revolution in integrated circuits that we were able to unleash. And he was able to chase Moore's law and drive down price performance. We would never have gotten price performance that essentially was such a huge deflationary pressure if it was locked up in the defense industrial base. And I think this is one of the main reasons that costs in defense rise faster than inflation. If we want to fix this trend, if we actually want to increase the amount of deflationary pressures, we have to be able to draft off of the commercial innovation that's happening. I'm not even sure I fully agree with the historical narrative that once upon a time, all this innovation happened in defense and now the R&D budgets are bigger in commercial. I think if you measure it, that's empirically true. But when I go back to this Noycean example, even then it was the commercial market that drove the price performance that Apollo and the DoD needed to get to the, Assault Breaker 1 would not have been possible without the commercial integrated circuit market driving the price performance.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, we do have this weird ecosystem. You'll hear phrases like butts and seats, and everything is, labor-based, FTEs, headcount, and we have these perverse incentives, like, for the way organizations operate, rather than efficiency, it's about growth. And that often means headcount and more hours and, not faster, better, cheaper, automated, et cetera. And I know you had this great piece, you mentioned Brian, like you guys had this great piece on War on the Rocks called Reflections on Software Lock-in at the Defense Department. And you use that, we talk about platforms, right? There's this burgeoning ecosystem of software factories, as they call them, right, in the DoD, where they're setting up these software factories. And in the piece, you guys are talking about, kind of the dichotomy between those versus commercial innovators and solutions that could be used in some cases. What are your thoughts about that versus like, DoD going out and building these bespoke, software factories in some cases versus using commercial technologies? And I think that, it's an interesting and nuanced topic. I will say that I've seen I've been on some of these programs, and like often there's like not invented here syndrome, or we could be paid more if we build this versus buy it. And then you talk about lock-in. Well, maybe you're not locked into a commercial software provider, but you're certainly locked into a system integrator or someone that helped develop the system or platform that you're using. And I know I'm going on a tangent here, but I'm curious your thoughts on this one.
This is a hugely important topic. I think the challenge here, it comes down to human factors. There's a tendency that we have a human bias, like when we make a decision, we suffer the consequence of that decision. We say like, I want that to never happen again. So I'm going to go shift all the way to the other side. Well, the opposite of one mistake is another mistake. And to your point, it's very nuanced. So you somehow have to hold the contradiction somewhere in between. And it requires a lot of human judgment. So where this applies is like the idea that there's no lock-in, like you're locked into every decision my engineers make, I'm locked into. The only question is, does it take me 2 days or 2 decades to switch? Like, what are my switching costs? When it takes 2 days, I don't really care. I don't need a governance process. I don't need to slow them down thinking about it. If it takes 2 decades, I care a lot, and I'm going to have a huge amount of scrutiny over, is this the right decision or not? And so we need to move away from a world where we think about vendor lock-in, because you're just locked in no matter what. We need to focus more on what are the switching costs. And in the commercial world, that's how people think about it. You don't hear the word vendor lock that often. They're thinking about like, this is what's driven the market towards APIs. And it's not even really coming from the customers. It's coming from the vendors who are trying to use openness as a competitive mechanism to enable them to get more business. And that's one of the market forces we've been unable to unleash inside of government, given how controlled the programs are. But I'm starting to see this happen. So with like our Army Vantage program, there are 1 million calls a month from Power BI into Vantage. And that's gotten to the point where now Microsoft and Palantir are figuring out, okay, well, how do we improve this interaction? How do we change our APIs to better service this need? And of course, that's going to be valuable not just to Power BI. In our case, it's going to be valuable to anyone who wants to access the information to a Tableau or to a Click. And vice versa, whatever they're doing is going to be valuable to any data platform that someone in Power BI is trying to use. And I think that's one of the more important, at some fundamental level, we either believe in the free market or we don't. And I like to quip that everyone, including the Russians and the Chinese, have given up on communism except for Cuba and the DoD. The way that we approach these things is very top-down, very command and control, 5-year plans, instead of encouraging more competition within government to create the sort of openness and innovation ecosystem that we really need. So to the point now, I'll come very directly to the platform piece. There's always some extreme of the distribution that people realize don't make sense. Does it make sense for the government to build their own AWS? I mean, probably not. Somehow people realize that would be like tens of billions of dollars. You're never going to be able to outcompete all of the commercial innovation stimulus they get from like the breadth of the thousands and thousands of customers they have. So that seems like a losing proposition. Then as you get closer and closer, well, I have a one-off app that I need to make. It seems very clear that you should just build that yourself. And then all of the complexity is somewhere in between. When I think about the platform infrastructure we've built, and you could multiply it by 10 or by 50 if you thought about AWS, but it took us 7 years and more than $1 billion just for the software infrastructure. And so, when the government starts thinking about, well, wouldn't it be better if I was not locked in and I built my own thing? We need the kind of intellectual honesty to say like, well, let's just say you're twice as good as Palantir. So it's going to be $500 million in 3.5 years. Are you signing up for that? And then, by the way, one of the paradoxes of software and budgeting is like when you think about hardware, you think about some big spike to buy the thing and then some tail to maintain it that goes down. Software only goes like this. You can debate what the slope is, but there's no capital investment then come down. And so when you get into that sort of loop, because you think that's what you need to convince the people in the Palm cycle or convince Congress of, you're essentially starting from a big lie. And then if software is going to just cost more over time, and you're paying, maybe you're paying twice as much, but you're getting 20 times as much capability. Then you want to figure out what is the broadest base I can amortize these expenses over, and how do I get that to subsidize the R&D that's happening? So I think over time we should be expecting the kind of needle to keep moving where things towards infrastructure and platform have to be commercial. It would be unaffordable otherwise. And as you get higher, and the commercial forces are going to drive openness, At the beginning of Kubernetes, we didn't have Helm charts. There was lots of opinionation that you could use. Now we do. That's an open source standard. Like the market is going to keep driving there. And then, as you get closer and closer to the end user applications, that's where things need to fit you like a highly tailored glove, where you expect the free market doesn't have enough. It is closer to monopsony. And that's where you want to spend your points and your limited capital to go after it. The other part about open source that I feel like people don't understand that's really important in government in particular is it's not some goody two-shoe movement. Like, where did this really come from? Open source is a ruthless business strategy to commoditize your complements, right? So if you're, the money to fund Linux is an attempt to undermine Microsoft Windows. It's undermine Sun and their proprietary Linux OS. The whole point was, if my customers only have so much wallet, how do I go after the parts that I depend on in the stack that I don't get paid for and commoditize that with open source? And I think that's healthy. That's the free market working, right? Like, let vendors try to commoditize their complements. But sometimes, and one of the most important vendors that's trying to do this here is the system integrators. Like, the more money spent on licensed software, the less money spent on butts in seats. And that's a problem for them. So of course, they're going to push the narrative of open source software. This reduces your vendor lock, probably increases your system integrator lock. And I think an educated government buyer can trade these things off. There's no, like, as I said, it's all very nuanced. You got to hold the tension between these things and figure out how you're going to make that decision. But where I feel like we've settled is something like open source only. I need to own this. And sometimes you have to question whether you're owning a depreciating asset. Do you really want to own this? It's a big burden.
Yeah. I was laughing, off the mic here, because I've literally gotten in these debates with people on programs I've supported, both from the government and industry partners. Is like open source, prevents the vendor lock. But really, what they're saying is, like, I'll have perpetual headcount to run, maintain, operate, patch, configure, et cetera, this tool or whatever for you in perpetuity, right? Rather than paying a licensing cost to a software company. And then it's also you get into these false dichotomy arguments about, like, it'll be more secure. It's like, really, you're going to secure this self-hosted instance of X better than a world-class, software company that's doing it for millions of users around the world? I don't know about that. And I'm in security making these, counter arguments sometimes. So it feels kind of silly. I wanted to ask you one other thing real quick here is, like, you talked about the market forces several times. One other thing I think that's missing in government, you talked about competing program offices, for example, but often there's a lot of, like, mandating. You must use X platform. And it's like the users doesn't even have a choice of what they want to use, whether the platform sucks or the technology or system, whatever it is, and they have no good alternatives to turn to because they're kind of being forced to use something, and there's no competitive, forces at play to force the system integrators or software companies or whomever to do better because they're forced to use something. What are your thoughts around, like, that versus diversity of choice and how that can drive competition among the user base up to the people making the software or platform?
I think choice is crucial. I mean, this is the analogy to, the system is kind of Soviet. We're going to mandate, you're going to use these things. The appearance of a unitary, united effort is going to drive efficiency. But actually, all it does is it reduces innovation. The innovation comes from people in the arena trying to figure out how to make it better, how to improve the cost performance, how to get incremental advantage in that experience. And when you grant a monopoly like that, maybe even to back up, I would say, as I run Palantir, I think one of my most important responsibilities in the technology organization is to grant and revoke monopolies. There are many times where there's just fundamental uncertainty, and I'd like multiple teams to feel like they can take a shot at this, they can come up with an idea, they can put it out there. And conversely, there are times where I just know we've gotten to the point that we have the right answer, and it's time to consolidate. So you can't actually solve this problem unless you're willing to manage it. The number of problems in the world that can be solved, like closed form solution, they're not that high, and those problems aren't that interesting because they've already been solved. Most of the interesting problems in the world have to be managed. They exist on some sort of unstable equilibrium. So you're going to need real leadership, capital L leadership, to call the shots, to make the decisions, to hold themselves accountable to, am I actually delivering a platform that deserves to have a monopoly, or do I need more competing efforts? And those things go through periods. I can remember one of our first technologies for synchronizing data across a DDoS mesh called Nexus peering. Very exquisite piece of technology back in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I had a team that came up, we called it the red-headed stepchild. They came up with a very heterodox way of doing the same thing with much lower latency, much faster. But, of course, the high priest who had built the original thing hated it. And, that's where the capital L leadership is needed in saying, I'm going to fund the red-headed stepchild and I'm going to enable them to compete. And now the whole mesh runs on the red-headed stepchild. Like the rebels won. And I think we need to enable more of that. Even Thomas Jefferson, in this wonderful letter he wrote to James Madison, said, from time to time, we do need rebellion. We can't totally squash it. It's a necessary part of rejuvenating the system.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of healthy friction, right? Is another way to think about it. So, last question for you. You and I were joking off air a little bit about, or not even joking, I should say. We were talking about this diagram from, I want to say it was CSIS or CNAS, one of these orgs. There's a lot of acronyms, a lot of orgs. They, did a study and they showed this chart of the defense industrial base versus the broader American economic system, and how their companies are kind of siloed in one of the two, right? And it's increasingly separate. We don't have this divergent ecosystem where companies are working with the government and working with commercial industry. They tend to be doing one or the other. And I know you talked about, you don't call it the defense industrial base, you call it the American industrial base. Like, what are your thoughts around the national security implications of having that, that system where they're really so rigidly separated rather than, one and the same? I think there's some pretty serious national security concerns in that regard.
There are huge implications for that. You think about the world that we're in today, where we struggle to build things in the quantities that we need them and the timeline we need them. Like the lead time on a Patriot is 8 years. That means like we're well outside the Davidson window before we can get another one if you introduce new demand signal now. So you could ask yourself the counterfactual question, why isn't Tesla making munitions? Their entire production line is exquisite and software defined. And I don't think it's fair to say that we're not great at making things in this country. It's just not in our legacy manufacturing base. So how do we get the folks who have the commercial expertise to come benefit national security in this sort of way? And I think that's important, because also when we just look at the history, it's the industrial base that won World War II and the Cold War. It was a base that I call dual purpose. I think sometimes we spend too much time on dual use. Like missiles are not dual use, but everything you learned about high scale production can help benefit the cost performance of producing missiles too. And I think having dual purpose companies is really critical. I'm a little depressed that, Ball sold off their aerospace division. They'd rather make beer cans than satellite buses. And I don't think that's Ball's fault. This is the consequence of monopsony. It's the root issue of what ails us. The government is not a great customer, and it needs to be thinking much more strategically about how it manages its relationships with its providers so that it can leverage this sort of innovation. The last great monopsony that most of us can really relate to is Walmart. If you grew up in the 90s and watched their commercials, it was everyday low prices. To be a supplier to Walmart was just they turned the screws on you on pricing. And they didn't see the massive competition that was coming from the side with Amazon, right? Like that. Why isn't Amazon Walmart? And it's because of the fixation of monopsony. And we have to make sure that we have those near peer, I would say peer threats around us today. And we have to think about, are these processes serving us or hurting us?
Yeah, well said. And I like the correction of not near peer, but peer in a lot of ways. I agree with you there. So that said, we ran the gamut of a lot of different topics from, cyber insurance, compliance, ATOs, platforms, the defense industrial base, et cetera. Where can folks learn more? What are you up to? Where can we go to learn some more about what you and the team at Palantir are up to?
Well, I write about these topics at firstbreakfast.com. And also, I'm very interested in externalizing this tool chain. So if there are startups or existing defense industrial base providers that want to figure out how to leverage some of the stuff that we've built in security and software infrastructure, just reach out to us on the Palantir website.
Awesome. Shyam, thanks so much for jumping on and diving into all this with me. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. Have a great day.
Thanks, Chris.